All right, so you're prepping for tech interviews, right? And you've probably heard the phrase practice makes perfect, like a million times.
Oh, yeah.
But we're going way beyond that with this deep dive. Think of it like this. You wouldn't just like run on a treadmill and hope to just magically finish a marathon, right? You'd want like a plan, maybe a coach, and definitely feedback on your form.
Yeah.
That's what's so cool about this guide we're looking at. It's like the ultimate training manual for turning mock interviews into like your secret weapon to just ace those tech interviews.
Exactly. It's about working smarter, not just harder. I once worked with this candidate. She was brilliant, like algorithms, no problem. But she would freeze up every time we got to the system design part of an interview.
Oh, yeah.
So we did a few mock interviews focusing just on that. And first she aced her next interview at this top tech company, but she actually taught me a new way to approach a tricky database problem.
Wow. See, that's what I love about mock interviews. They can even benefit the interviewer.
Right.
Okay, so this guide, it's not just telling us to do mock interviews. It's like it gets into the why, the how to make the most of them, all of that good stuff, right?
Absolutely, yeah. One of the first things it digs into is the psychology.
Okay.
Because interviews, let's face it, they can be nerve-wracking.
Oh, yeah.
Mock interviews are like that pregame warm-up, helps you shake off the jitters, and then when the pressure's on, you can perform at your best.
Totally. Like, I remember my first few tech interviews, so nervous. I'm pretty sure I, like, blanked on basic coding concepts. Like, it really is a totally different vibe. It's like taking a test versus explaining something you know well to a friend.
Precisely. And beyond just, like, calming the nerves, mock interviews help you identify your weaknesses. Like, let's say you tend to jump into coding before fully understanding the problem. A common pitfall, by the way.
Oh, yeah.
In a mock interview, you get to catch yourself, do course correct, and it's low stakes, you know.
It's like having that safety net to try different approaches and see what works for you. Okay, speaking of different approaches, the guide mentions that not all interviews are created equal. What are some of the different types of tech interviews that someone should, be prepared for?
That's a great question. So you'll likely encounter anything from, like, rapid-fire algorithmic challenges. You might be asked to invert a binary tree on a whiteboard.
Okay.
To, like, in-depth system design discussions you need to architect a scalable solution. And let's not forget those behavioral interviews all about soft skills and how you'd handle real-world situations.
Okay, so it's not even just about knowing how to code. You have to explain your thought process, design these complex systems, and even, like, navigate tricky situations with people.
Yeah.
Phew, that's a lot.
It can feel overwhelming.
Yeah.
That's actually why this guide really emphasizes creating the right environment for your mock interviews.
Okay.
It's about recreating that interview experience as closely as possible so you can practice under realistic conditions.
So are they suggesting that we, like, wear our fanciest interview outfit while we're coding in our pajamas at home?
Not quite.
Well, it doesn't need to be that extreme, right?
Right.
I mean, the guide does highlight the importance of a few simple things, like setting a timer. That can really simulate that time pressure you feel in a real interview.
Absolutely, yeah.
And then using a whiteboard or maybe like a shared coding platform like you might actually encounter during a virtual interview gets you comfortable with the tools.
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
And then even, I think they said, like, just sitting up straight, making good eye contact.
Right.
Like, all of that can actually make a difference in your confidence and how you come across, right?
It's like tricking your brain into thinking it's the real deal,
Yeah, totally. Okay, so we've got our timer set, whiteboard's ready, maybe even a suit jacket on top, pajama pants on the bottom. Gotta keep it comfy. So how do we actually use this mock interview to improve? I know the guide talks about asking the right questions, but what does that even look like in practice?
So it's about shifting from memorization to understanding.
Okay.
Let's say you're prepping for those algorithmic challenges, and you come across this problem on Leetcode, right? About finding the shortest path in a graph. So instead of just memorizing Dijkstra's algorithm, you really want to dive deeper, right?
Oh.
Why does this algorithm work? What are its limitations? Could I apply, like, a similar approach to a different type of problem?
So it's like, don't just learn the recipe, understand the science of baking, right?
Exactly.
Become a baking master instead of just someone who can follow the instructions.
Yeah, and that deeper understanding, it'll help you adapt to new challenges and explain your thought process more effectively.
Which is key in an interview, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay, and speaking of explaining your thought process, this guide is all about this think aloud problem solving, which honestly kind of sounds a little awkward. Is it really necessary to, like, explain every little thing you're thinking while you're, in the middle of coding?
It might feel unnatural at first, but trust me, it is a game changer.
Okay.
So imagine you're asked to, like, reverse a linked list in an interview, right? If you just start coding silently, the interviewer, they only see the end result.
Yeah.
But if you verbalize your thought process like, okay, I need to iterate through this list, but instead of moving forward, I need to reverse these pointers, you're giving them a window into your problem-solving skills, even if you make a mistake or two along the way.
Oh, that's a good point, yeah. It's like showing your work in math class, right? Even if the final answer is not perfect, at least the teacher can see your logic and how you got there.
Precisely. And this is where mock interviews really shine, because you get to practice that, like, thinking out loud in a low-pressure environment, You could even record yourself and analyze your performance afterwards.
Okay.
Do you use a lot of filler words? Do you explain things clearly, concisely? All of that.
Ooh, recording myself during a mock interview. Now that's, like, next level. Although I might need to wear a paper bag over my head for the first few takes. But I get it.
It can be a little awkward.
Yeah.
But the insights you gain are so valuable.
Yeah. Okay.
And speaking of insights, let's talk about feedback. This is where mock interviews really go from, like, good to great.
Okay, so we've survived the mock interview. Whiteboards covered in code, maybe some sweat on our brow.
Right.
What now? How do we actually make sure that all that effort translates into, like, real improvement?
This is where having that mock interview partner is so valuable.
Okay.
Whether it's a friend, a mentor, or even just someone else who's also going through the interview process, right?
Yeah.
The guy talks about both giving and receiving feedback.
Okay.
So when you're giving feedback, you start to pick up on those subtle cues that interviewers might notice.
Okay.
Like, did the candidate clearly define the problem? Did they consider those edge cases?
Edge cases, those are like the plot twists of the coding world, right? The unexpected scenarios that can really throw a wrench in your, like, perfectly designed algorithm. Like when a user tries to enter a negative number for their age on a registration form, that kind of thing.
Exactly. Thinking about edge cases, it demonstrates a deeper understanding of the problem and a more, like, robust coding approach.
Okay, yeah.
And when you're on the receiving end of feedback, super important to be open to that constructive criticism, right?
Yeah.
And to ask clarifying questions.
Yeah, that actually reminds me of something I read in the guide about finding your mock interview, like, squad. They even mention online communities like Reddit and Discord, where you can connect with other people who are also, like, going through that interview prep.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like having this whole support system, right? Cheering you on and sharing their tips and tricks. It can make all the difference when you're tackling something as, like, challenging as tech interviews.
Absolutely. And that's actually a great segue into something else I wanted to touch on. Different interviews, different approaches.
Okay.
So the guide briefly mentions all these different types of technical interviews, and they each have their own unique challenges, their own expectations.
Yeah.
We talked about algorithmic challenges earlier, but what about those system design interviews? Those can be especially intimidating.
Yeah, system design interviews do seem like a whole other beast.
Yeah.
Instead of just focusing on, like, the lines of code, you're talking about architecting these massive systems, right? It's like the difference between baking a cake and designing a whole bakery.
That's a great analogy. With system design interviews, you really need to be thinking about scalability, reliability, efficiency.
Yeah.
How will your system handle, like, millions of users?
Oh, wow.
What happens if one part of the system fails?
Okay.
These are the types of questions you should be prepared to answer.
So it's less about knowing, like, a specific coding language and more about just having this deep understanding of how systems work together, kind of like a master architect, right? Like, they know how to design a building that's beautiful, but it's also functional.
Precisely. And the best way to prepare for these types of interviews is to actually design systems. Now, you don't need to build the next Facebook or anything for your mock interview.
Okay.
But you could try designing, like, a simplified version of a real-world system.
Okay.
For example, how would you design a system to handle ride-sharing requests, like an Uber or a Lyft?
Okay.
What data structures would you use? How would you handle user authentication? Payments.
Okay, yeah, I see how all the pieces are kind of coming together now. It's about identifying those different types of interviews you'll encounter, understanding what you need to know for each one, and then tailoring your mock interview practice.
Exactly. And remember, it's not just about acing those technical questions, right? Behavioral questions are so important, especially as you progress in your career.
Okay.
Interviewers want to see that you're not just a coding machine. You're a good communicator, a problem solver, a team player, all of that.
So how